Well, welcome and thank you everyone for joining us. So we're going to go ahead and start in just a moment as people come in and join in with us. So what we do, my name is Kevin Bowling. I'm the executive director of the Secular Student Alliance. We'll begin this webinar shortly, but I do want to tell you about our one coming up. So our next webinar is on Tuesday, November 9th. And from Columbia University, we have Liz Reiner Platt, who is going to discuss the progressive vision for secular religious liberty rights, formulated by legal scholars and theologians in a report that's titled All Faiths and None, a guide for protecting religious liberty for everybody. So we hope you will join us for that, and you can sign up for that at secularstudents.org/webinars. So we will be having the panel discussion today, combating Christian attacks on trans existence. So we'll have the panel discussion and then followed by a Q&A session from questions from you and other participants. So if you would like to ask questions, please feel free to use the Q&A tab in Zoom and to type your question in for the panelists. So I'm excited having everyone here today for combating Christian attacks on trans existence. So for several decades, the conservative religious right has intentionally targeted the LGBT community, from same-sex marriage and civil rights and housing and adoption and employment. The focus of the religious right has transitioned over the past few years to focus on the trans community. So using some of the same tactics that they were with the LGBT community, they are working hard to create a second-class status and denying basic human rights for trans people. So there were over 110 bills introduced across 33 states directly attacking the rights of LGBTQ individuals. And state legislatures are increasing their attacks, especially on trans youth, introducing bills aimed to restrict children's access to healthcare, prohibiting them from engaging in school activities, and accessing public spaces. So during this webinar, we'll discuss the strategies that conservative Christian organizations have used to target gay and lesbian people and now to target trans people, talk about some of the current discriminatory legislation targeting trans people, and more importantly, what secular people can do. So very pleased to have with me Christy Stroop, ex-evangelical writer and activist. Also Allison Gill, the Vice President of Legal and Policy at American Atheist, and Rodrigo Hang-Lignanen, Executive Director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. So we're going to go ahead and start by jumping into questions. And Christy, love to start with you. So clearly the legal and legislative aspect of the conservative effort to codify religious-based discrimination against trans people is important. But there's also an aspect of attacking trans people in society. So I'd love if you could start us off by sharing some of the ways in which gay and lesbian people were demonized and targeted in society more general, and sort of what tactics are now being used to target trans people specifically.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for having me, Kevin. It's always great to join you for an event like this. So when it comes to the Christian right, my knowledge comes from both personal lived experience. I grew up evangelical, Christian school education, very right-wing culture-warring environment as a kid, and also from academic study. I have a PhD in modern Russian history, actually, but interestingly enough, I kind of brought that full circle with the American Christian right by studying religious ideology and looking at the history of anti-communism, in which, interestingly enough, Russian Christians had a big impact on Westerners, including Americans, during the Cold War. And it's during the Cold War that the modern Christian right sort of starts to form, in reaction to the communist threat. There's this general drive in American society to use religion to fight the communist threat. So there's promotion of religion by business elites, cultural elites, philanthropists, preachers like Billy Graham, and the government itself. And so you have this official ideology that's supposed to be like a little more inclusive or pluralist, right? But Americans are religious and atheists are commies and bad. But what emerges from that and what becomes the Christian right as we know it today is this very virulent form of Christian nationalism. And of course, during the Cold War, you also have the civil rights movement. And as soon as in American history, and really in history generally, certainly in Western history, when one group that has been systematically discriminated against starts to gain rights and gain recognition in public opinion that they should have equal rights with everyone else, and there's always this severe backlash. So the Christian right, as we know it today, is this very reactionary force that comes out of these kind of general Cold War trends, is initially concerned with things like keeping public schools as Protestant as possible. So school prayer, there were Supreme Court decisions about that in the 1960s, Abington v. Schempp, for example, and with continuing to have the right to discriminate against people of color. And that's why they actually began founding the kinds of Christian schools that I was educated in as a kid in the 1980s and the 1990s. Many of those were formed explicitly as segregation academies. So, they're fighting for basically white privilege and, patriarchal male privilege. And when what was then called gay rights comes into the mix, part of the reason it's so important to them is that it problematizes their understanding of what gender roles should be. It just kind of is seen as a very threatening thing. And this is already coming along by the time that we see in the 1970s, the formulation of the kinds of political lobbying organizations that will give the Christian right in the future the kind of power that they have today. And the first election where that is really felt is the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So, you think 1970s, you're probably thinking Roe v. Wade, 1973, abortion becomes a big deal to evangelicals, but it doesn't actually, not until about 1978, 1980. They're still stuck on the right to discriminate against, especially African Americans and people of color in the early 1970s, and it's not quite impossible for them to say that out loud yet and still be considered respectable in mainstream American society. But they're also starting to get fixated, in addition to school prayer, as I mentioned, on gay rights. And so they use this rhetoric that we continue to see later about, the family, the natural family, we need to protect family values, and so forth, as a means of centering themselves as the norm. The middle class sort of nuclear family ideal that dates back to Victorian England actually is really a pretty modern thing, as opposed to any other model of family, and representing people who fall outside of that as threatening to children, to society, and so forth. And so in the 1970s, you have the founding of all these organizations that are still with us today as major lobbies and are opposed to LGBTQ rights, in particular to trans rights. You have the Heritage Foundation, founded in 1973. You have Focus on the Family, founded in 1977, yes, 77. And you have the Moral Majority, founded in 1979, associated with people like Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. and Pat Robertson, who founded the Christian Broadcasting Network back in the 1960s. All right, so by the 70s, you started to see, gay people, gay men and lesbians gaining some rights in some places. You have some local non-discrimination ordinances passed. And it's right there that you see the Christian right, the usual suspects who are always trying to keep their power and privilege over everybody, start to fight against that. And they'll use the same kind of tropes and same kind of tactics later on members of the trans community, or certainly you can see a lot of parallels. The face of this in the 1970s is a woman named Anita Bryant. She was a popular singer and a representative of, I believe the official title was the Florida Citrus Commission. She sold orange juice. And she was a good, God-fearing, white conservative Christian American who just could not stand the fact that gays were getting some rights in some places. So, there was one of these non-discrimination ordinances passed in Dade County, Florida in 1977. Anita Bryant began to lead a Save Our Children campaign to fight back against this. And, started using a lot of these tropes that would become very common, and certainly that I would also hear growing up with this in the 1980s, that, gay people are unnatural, they can't reproduce, so they have to recruit, which means they prey on our children, they're coming for your kids. We see this again today in, sort of trumped up, let's say, pun quasi-intended fears about, trans people, particularly trans women in women's bathrooms, as if, we're actually, quote unquote, men in dresses who just want to prey on kids. That actually is not a thing. You can't find a single incident of this actually happening, but they create this fearful image of, the trans or the gay predator. If you want to see some really wild propaganda examples of this from around the 1970s and the 1980s, especially the 1980s and the AIDS crisis era, look at tracks produced by this guy named Jack Chick. They are wild. And, Chick, he absolutely represents people in the gay community as deliberately recruiting and spreading AIDS on purpose, and AIDS is also God's punishment. But even as recently as 2013, Pat Robertson spread these rumors on his program, the 700 Club, that some gay men in San Francisco supposedly wear these weird rings that have a little sharp point on them, so they cut people to give them AIDS. Completely absurd and offensive, but the Christian right is really good at drumming up this kind of fear. So at first, in the mid to late 1970s, they're successful at overturning gay rights. So Anita Bryant leading this campaign, they end up overturning gay rights ordinances in a number of cities across the country, including in Eugene, Oregon, for example, which is not far from where I am in Portland. But she kind of overplays her hand by 1978 when she's part of a coalition that tries to pass a ballot initiative in California, the Briggs Initiative, which actually would have banned out gay and lesbian people from teaching in public schools, and also would have gotten anyone fired who spoke in favor of gay rights as a teacher in a public school. Now, why would they focus on schools again? Because they're saying these people are coming for your kids. They're dangerous. They're not like us. They hate the family. Now, that initiative was actually opposed even by Ronald Reagan, and it failed. But, in the meantime, they had overturned a lot of ordinances that were meant to provide non-discrimination. So it's part of this backlash, and we constantly see this, right? What we also see with the Christian right is a pattern of scapegoating. You have to have somebody that you can deflect your own anxieties onto. And so LGBTQ people in general, gay and lesbian people from the 1970s certainly have been one easy group to target with this. But, with same-sex marriage becoming the law of the land through the Obergefell decision in 2015, a lot of right-wing Christians are admitting to themselves that the ship has kind of sailed there. At least privately, they will admit this, and sometimes publicly. And so they focus on someone else. It's interesting, too, that, again, in the context of the 60s and the 70s, we're starting to see large numbers, a large proportion of people in the American public coming face to face with the fact that child sex abuse is a thing that exists for the first time. This is a new national conversation in the 60s and 70s. Comes out of, research that doctors had been doing in the 40s and 50s, but still wasn't much in the public eye. And as was discovered pretty quickly, and as we know now, child abuse is most frequently carried out by people in the child's own family or close family friends, and of course, also by trusted people like clergy in patriarchal environments like churches, where you have these kinds of male authority figures with access to children and unearned trust. Bad things happen. Here's the thing. A lot of conservative people don't want to admit that child sex abuse is actually a problem that's close to home, and so they project it out on some out groups that they imagine to be especially and unusually monstrous. In the 1980s, we saw this with the Satanic Panic. And, I don't want to take too much time to try to go over that in great detail, but there were all these child sex abuse cases that were said to involve satanic ritual abuse, huge FBI investigations. Some people were put in prison for a very long time on very, very dubious charges. In many cases, there was just no there at the end of the day for the particular cases that were brought to trial. The whole satanic element of it is its own interesting story in itself. But one thing that we did see throughout that whole episode was that queer people were also especially targeted and singled out, even when the evidence clearly pointed in different directions. And there were some queer people who were indicted and convicted on what we now can clearly see to be false charges at this point in time. So anyway, hopefully with that just sort of background, you can kind of see the parallels to the situation that we're seeing today, where the emphasis has shifted to scapegoat the trans community. Sometimes the same tactics as well. When Charlotte, North Carolina passed a non-discrimination ordinance in 2016, allowing trans people to use bathrooms that, are in line with our gender identity. Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, fought hard. A lot of other right-wing Christians fought hard to overturn that ordinance, and they overturned it. At the state level, interestingly, through the state legislature, against the will of the people who lived in Charlotte. But anyway, all right, I'll stop there for now. Sorry.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think the historical perspective in the United States is really important to understand. And so, yeah, and I think the religious right has established an organized and consistent effort against civil rights for lesbian and gay people, which has now sort of been updated over the last few years to specifically target trans people, and especially trans youth. So Allison, I hope you could help us understand this arc to sort of legally codify this discrimination.
Sure, I'm happy to, but I want to see if Rodrigo has any more to add on what to sort of talk about the transition first.
Oh, sure. You go ahead and start, Allison, and I can chime in after. Thank you, though.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll talk about legal in a minute, but I guess I just wanted to sort of mention a little bit about why, Chrissy was sort of set the bigger picture here, but, I think there's a real focus on trans people because of a few factors that really make them sort of stand out. After, as Chrissy was saying, the marriage equality sort of wins by our side, really trans people are sort of a soft target. I mean, most people tend not to really understand trans issues that well. Most people don't know trans people, and that's starting to change, but it's still a very small percentage compared to like LGBT people, for example. And they lack political power. Trans people are a small minority, and so they lack political power, and that makes a real difference. So rather than trying to sort of address like real issues, I mean, this is what we see constantly from the right and basically proto-fascists in general, is to focus on small minority, populations where they can focus a program onto and distract from bigger issues. And so that's what we're seeing over and over again, not just on trans people these days, and on immigrants, on a number of different things, but it's definitely focused on trans people. And unfortunately, it's having real repercussions, including this sort of flurry of state laws we're seeing around the country. And maybe Rodrigo, you'd want to go into that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's absolutely right. And I would really echo what Chrissy and kind of Allison, you also said about this being about backlash, and the extent to which the trans people in particular may be being targeted today, but it is part of a broader anti-LGBTQ strategy. So really, we see this happen whenever any movement makes progress. It is always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We've seen backlash against racial justice or against people of color in really concerted, particular, specific, targeted ways. in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act being passed, well, Civil Rights Act in 1964. So this is unfortunately a part of how American society works. It doesn't make it good, but it does make it a dynamic that we have to reckon with. I think what we are dealing with right now when it comes to anti-trans attacks is this is the attempt by the opposition broadly, and especially right-wing kind of nationalist leaning groups or right-wing Christian nationalist leaning groups to get some kind of foothold in what they otherwise perceive as a losing battle on LGBTQ rights. They went after gay and lesbian people, and very specifically before, because really they just were trying to go after anyone who had a different idea of sexual orientation, anyone who had a different idea of gender, and really anyone who had a different idea of family, even if they were straight and cisgender, meaning non-transgender. If you just had a different kind of idea of family formation, then they were opposed. So they went after gay and lesbian people as a strategy there. Public support for gay and lesbian people and gay and lesbian rights has grown, which is fantastic. So now the opposition is trying a different tactic. They're going after transgender people like us, all the panelists on this, and transgender youth, especially, as a concerted strategy to try to go after the kind of smallest opponents, the people who they perceive as otherwise being the least powerful and the most vulnerable. But really, they're just trying to undermine support against LGBTQ rights across the board. And I don't know if you want me to speak to the bills in the state. Happy to do that, but I was going on a while, so.
I was just about to say, I think it'd be great if you can sort of give us a sort of prelude into what's happening at state capitals with sort of anti-trans discrimination and legislation.
Sure. So as folks may have already seen in headlines, but maybe not, there is quite a wave of these anti-trans bills. Oh, I think you actually said it up top. Over 110 bills were filed this last legislative session. And they represent the majority of the states. You look at the map and all these states where bills were introduced, it is over half of the country. Really, though, it's the same kind of bill over and over and over again. This is not an organic movement. This is coordinated strategy, like we've been talking about, right? So it's really three kinds of bills that we see replicated constantly. The first is about healthcare. The second is about participation in school activities. And the third is accessing public space, but especially sports. And I'll go over each of them just really briefly. So the first about healthcare. These are bills that attempt to criminalize transgender youth accessing transition-related healthcare. And really, this can go quite sweeping, depending on the state. There have been bills that even touch mental health care. And there are some that are more squarely about physical health, for lack of a better term. But really, at the end of the day, these would categorically block a young transgender person from being able to access healthcare services. This is really alarming, most especially because this is routine healthcare. The opposition will make it out to be some kind of experiment. They will characterize this as though this healthcare is understudied or somehow irresponsible. But in truth, every single leading medical institution in the United States has studied transition-related care, including studied it specifically in youth, and determined that it is essential primary healthcare. Now, every single patient is going to have a different course of treatment, right? Just like it is with any other health condition out there. So the individual needs of any given young person are going to vary. But there are best practices. There is consistent research that makes it pretty clear what kinds of health services are appropriate for trans youth, universally understood to be essential healthcare. And that primary care is what these bills would categorically ban. It would actually make it illegal for a young person to access these services. So number two, school activities. So this we see this the most on sports. And actually, these are the only two that I'll cover because I think want to leave time for the other things, and these are the most common. But yeah, the other one is really restricting trans youth ability to participate in school activities, but they only kind of talk about sports. They shine the spotlight on sports teams. Again, we see these opposition organizations spreading a lot of misinformation and fear mongering and scapegoating. The really important thing to remember here is that these are just young people who are trying to play on a sports team with their friends like anyone else. This is not elite competition. This is not the Olympics. This is not, this is not playing in the NBA or the NFL, which are probably the only two sports leagues I know how to cite because I'm not a sports person. But, this is not like high level competition where a lot of money is on the line. This is just about playing on a school team with your friends. This is about the 9th grade girl who wants to play volleyball. This is very routine stuff that if a trans young person is singled out and excluded from, it is like putting a target on their back. It is like the school or the government saying you do not belong and you're not allowed to hang out with your friends like a normal kid. That is the human effect of all of this. That is why it feels so emotional and why it's so powerful, even to a trans young person who has no interest in being a professional athlete. It is still about being singled out for a different kind of treatment. And I think it's really important for all of us to really remind each other of the humanity behind this. Otherwise, it's very easy for the sports bills to turn into a debate about testosterone and competitive advantage. But let's remember that this is about kids. This is about young people who are going to school with their peers, and they need to be able to participate in school activities just like any of their peers.
If I could jump in and, talk about a few other types of bills that we're seeing in the States, because I feel like these really help illustrate the sort of nexus we're seeing between sort of religious groups and transphobia, because they really do address it. And, those are the very specific anti-trans bills, but there's lots of other bills that actually touch on trans issues that maybe aren't always thought about as trans bills. And I think the primary one that I want to point out is what are called denial of care laws. So these are bills or laws that say basically that healthcare providers like doctors, and in some states it even goes so far as say like, hospitals, insurers, employers that buy health insurance, do not have to provide coverage of anything they religiously or morally disagree with. Now, in some states, in most states, it's narrow. It applies to only a few things like abortion, contraception. It's still, we would still oppose it. However, we at American Atheists would still oppose them, and they're not as broad as the ones we're seeing more recently. In the past year, we've seen two pass in two states, Arkansas and Ohio, that are far broader, that allow them to refuse any kind of medical care for any moral or religious reason. And that often, it's not spelled out in the text, but that's often used against trans people. And again, we're not even talking about trans specific types of care. Like there's a lot of history in this community, of the trans community, of people being denied any form of medical care, even basic medical care, because they assume any medical care you get to be trans related. That very often happens. And so this is going to result, these laws, in people not being able to access care in certain places, being turned away, being discriminated against. So it's very real. And we see religion is being used here to sort of exclude people. I think that's a really good example. Another one is we're seeing opposition to comprehensive sex education. We and other groups support comprehensive sex education because everything from common sense to all the research shows, kids need that to grow up and be successful and thrive. It's really important to know how your body works and how to, there's a lot of important things there. But there's a lot of groups opposing comprehensive sex education. And one of the reasons is that they point to trans people and saying as part of sex education, hey, people have different gender identities, trans people exist in the world. They're used as a boogeyman and taught that is teaching transgender or whatever. It doesn't actually make any sense, but that's sort of the scaremongering that we see. And similarly,
if I could just quickly piggyback there, that's
sure.
very much an example of this trope of recruiting now, except they sort of updated to say, well, this is all trendy now, and kids see their friends wanting to be trans and then they want to be trans too, which is also completely absurd. But it's a natural sort of evolution of that playbook, I think.
Yeah, and that actually feeds in really well to the next bill I was going to talk about, which is the so-called parental rights bills. So these are bills that are supposedly based on parental rights, but they really are, they give, the school must inform parents about any clubs a student belongs to, so that if they're a member of a gay straight alliance, a GSA, or for that matter, an SSA, a secular student alliance, they have to tell the parents about that and in a way sort of out them. They deny any form of medical care without being pre-approved by parents, being informed or outed if a child does identify as trans or gender nonconforming, pre-approval and warning about any sort of education about sexuality, which can include even anti-bullying training sometimes, depending on how these are defined. So this is just a few examples. I'm happy to go into others, but I wanted to just give a taste of these other issues, which definitely are related to religion and trans, even if people don't call them out that way all the time.
And I think it's important for all of us to understand that. And as I think you pointed out, not only while they're disguised as other things, they're being targeted a lot of times at trans people, but also affect a lot of other people, and including secular people and non-religious people. So it's important that the secular community is aware of what's going on and is advocates for this as well. And I think I always appreciate the sort of ground state game that American Atheist plays in looking at legislation, those are things. But you've also been doing a lot of research on various subpopulations of non-religious people, including trans people. And so I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about sort of non-religious trans and non-gender conforming people.
Sure, and this is a little bit of a preview. I mean, we're going to be releasing a whole report on this coming up. So it's right now in the work. So I have some data to give you, but there'll be a lot more in the future, which is exciting. But we did a survey of about 34,000 non-religious people in 2019, which is a huge number. And about 25% of them, a quarter, were LGBTQ. So it's a very high percentage, and about 3.6% were trans or gender nonconforming, which is also a very high percentage compared to the full population. It's really notable, though, that for people under 35, age 35 or younger, they were 3 times as likely to identify as trans or gender nonconforming. So it was much higher. It's closer to about 10%. Overall LGBTQ participants, and I don't have breakouts on trans, I'm sorry. LGBTQ participants faced a higher level of family rejection than other non-religious people. It was about 1/2 faced some form of family rejection, as opposed to 1/3. 1/2 compared to 1/3 of non-LGBTQ people concealed their non-religious beliefs from their extended family. So a lot more, if you're both non-religious and LGBTQ, you're more likely to conceal your beliefs. Anyway, I don't have a ton of stats on that right now, but I'm just sort of stressing that we will have a new report. I'm excited about it.
No, and that's great, and we're looking forward to that. And I know for the Secular Student Alliance, and while we did a survey of our students, and about 20% of our students and student leaders and members identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, an additional 5% as trans and gender nonconforming. So compared to the general population, we do see a much larger participation, I think, because of the inclusion, diversity, and acceptance, and the religious discrimination that people are feeling. So I'm glad we touched a little bit on some of the state's courts, and I think
actually, Kevin, I think Rodrigo, you have a lot of stats. You want to talk about any of those?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to chime in. So another statistic to add on this is that at NCTE, National Center for Transgender Equality, we run the largest study of trans people's experiences. So this one is trans specific, and we run it roughly every 5 years. It's called the USTS, US Trans Survey. Very straightforward name. And we found that respondents, we pull on a lot of things. One of them is if there's any religious affiliation or et cetera, et cetera. And we found that respondents were most likely to identify as agnostic. That was actually the highest out of all of the possibilities. That was 23%. And then the second most common experience was atheist, which is 22%. So that right there, what's the math? 45, something like that. 45% of folks describe themselves as atheist or agnostic specifically. That does not even take into account people who otherwise describe themselves in ways that could be interpreted as still be under the secular umbrella. There were other people who just said, I don't have a religious affiliation and left it at that. So again, even more data to point to there being a correlation here, or at least disproportionate, right? Outsized from the general population. I will do a little plug here that we're fielding the survey again next year. In February of 2022, the survey will be out again for people to complete it. So if you are trans, please sign up to participate in the survey. If you're not trans, but know people who you are, which I bet you do because you're joining this webinar right now, encourage them to sign up as well. It's really a treasure trove of data. It's used constantly in activism and advocacy, not just by NCTE, but by organizations all around the country. We know that legislators will often deny that a problem exists. And this data is our way of proving that the problem does exist, and which is the first step to getting a bill passed to solve these problems. We can't solve a problem that we can't even prove exists. So February 22, get ready to fill out the survey.
Well,
and you can sign up at ustranssurvey.org.
Great. And what we can do is I can throw that link in the email that goes out after the webinar.
I actually see a question about our survey, and that's how can you get in the distribution list? You can sign up at americanatheists.org, and also you can go to secularsurvey.org. That's where we store the main report we did on 34,000, as well as the youth report we were very happy to put out with Secular Student Alliance, and the recently published Black Non-Religious report as well. So there'll be others there in time. Or you could also sign up and you'll be emailed about it. Either way.
Great. I was just about to mention the secular survey. So yes, some good stuff there. And so I think one of the things that I think is of interest to people, especially considering the representation on the Supreme Court at the moment, what do we expect to happen in the courts, and is there something that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Sure, there's a lot of things. The courts are very busy these days. So I don't know if everyone knows this. I'm sure, there might probably more awareness within LGBTQ communities, but one of the most important Supreme Court cases for LGBTQ equality ever was decided last year with the Bostock v. Clayton County decision, which basically says that, federal non-discrimination laws, specifically Title VII, the protections based on sex do include gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination. So it's really helpful. It sort of extends that our federal civil rights protections are broadly applicable. And, it's great that the administration is currently taking that decision and moving forward with it and working on implementing it, because that's really critical. But the decision does leave, unfortunately, some wiggle room around the area of religious exemptions. And unfortunately, that's what we're going to be seeing from the opposition to equality, is that they're going to try to more so cut religious exemption holes into these protections. And we're already seeing that in different cases. In Fulton v. City of Philadelphia decided this year, the decision was focused on specific language creating discretion within a contract. However, the manner in which the court treated the strict scrutiny analysis, that is, I won't go into too much technical detail, but whether preventing LGBTQ discrimination was a compelling interest, the way they decided it was fairly alarming. And sort of portends potential legal consequences. They focus very, very closely on this specific situation, as opposed to looking more broadly on the impact of discrimination, to put it shortly, which is a dangerous way to look at discrimination, because it's not always about the individual person and can they get the service somewhere else. One of the major reasons we'd oppose discrimination is because it's what's called a dignitary harm. It harms the population of those people, right? It's not always just about the one person, whether they can go get a cake made somebody else. It's about the broader injury to the community and to the person when they are turned away and denied. And and they can't function equally, be treated equally in society. That's a harm. And the court we hope continues to look at it that way, but that's risky. So anyway, that's some of the major things. I can go into more specifics about small cases, but I think I'll stop there and see if you have any more specific questions.
Great. And I think if people have questions on specific things, they're more than happy to throw those in the Q&A. And would anyone else like to add, or we can move on? Cool. Well, I think one thing for Chrissy, you recently had your article that came out with some of the data from PPRI, specifically talking about the support of pro-LGBT policies in the United States. But you really dove in and sort of looked at white evangelicals and trans issues. So I wonder if you could share some of the highlights of that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, since I come from a white evangelical background, I do tend to focus on that. But also, there's a reason to focus on white evangelicals, and that's that they just tend to be across the board the most illiberal, anti-democratic, anti-pluralist, generally worst demographic on these issues. And so the headline that we used for that article on Religion Dispatches, where I'm a senior correspondent, is white evangelicals are America's most anti-trans demographic. Nothing too surprising there, but still it's important to document. When you start to dive into the nitty-gritty, which we can do because thankfully, PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, has been asking questions in its public opinion surveys about trans people and trans rights since 2011. So we have, this comparable data from different years to look at, and they can look at trends. We see that, overall, there's relatively good news for the LGBTQ community because it's over 80%. Let me see, I wrote this down just to make sure I get that exactly right. It's 82% of Americans overall are in favor of broad non-discrimination of the sort that was recognized by the Bostock decision. So, that looks pretty good. The secular community is doing the best overall there at 91% at this, very basic bar here. And evangelicals are doing the worst, white evangelicals, although still a majority, 66%, so about 2/3 of them say they support those kinds of non-discrimination protections. Here's where reading the fine print becomes really important. And it has everything to do with exactly what Allison was just discussing relative to religious exemptions and using religious exemptions for, pretty extreme things, denial of healthcare, the denial of service, like, if you want to have a cake for your same-sex wedding or whatever. And it turns out that 62% of white evangelicals, so close to that 2/3 figure, are for service refusal exemptions. And that is actually up from 54% in 2019. So they're looking at that as, a way to preserve power and privilege going ahead. Exemption is going to be the name of the game on some of these issues. Although with the Supreme Court, I think we should also say that I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if they did just outright overturn Roe and Obergefell, and the Supreme Court is quite radical right, even for the radical right. So it's really all bets are off as to how far they might go. But other kind of trends that we're seeing there, unfortunately, on the specific issues of bathroom access and school sports, we have seen across demographics, left and right, non-religious, religious, different religious denominations, a decline in the percentage of Americans who support trans kids participating in school sports and trans access to bathrooms that conform with our gender identity. And I think that has a lot to do with just the really sort of full court press disinformation campaign that's been waged by the right and also by so-called trans exclusionary radical feminists. And it's interesting. I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, those folks worked together too. The anti-porn, anti-sex worker, not sex positive feminists were happy to shake hands with James Dobson, and we see that kind of thing going on again today. though again, it certainly is the Christian right specifically is is kind of the biggest threat to wider equality and human rights. But one more positive note in that data is that, knowing a trans person also makes a huge difference across the board. And we're seeing, more and more Americans recognize that they know someone who is trans all the time. So that gives me a little bit of hope for the future. And the rest of those numbers, there's a whole lot of numbers. So I'll let you go look at them yourself, but those are the broad trends in the data.
And in the email that we send out afterwards, we'll go ahead and include the link to that article. So it's a good article. And I think it's important that while trends are getting better and acceptance is getting better, it's important for us to realize that the major force in the US right now really is an issue of separation of church and state. And it's religious people trying to get religious dogma codified into our societies and in our laws. And I think we've talked a good bit about focusing on anti-trans discrimination, but there is an interrelatedness with how church-state separation issues, and I think as you started mentioning, Chrissy, impact women's reproductive health and the possible future of same-sex marriage, even racial justice issues. So I think, if the religious community, religious right, is successful in their anti-trans issues, what does that mean for some of these other groups and issues? Anyone who
let me just say quickly, the same people who are, most adamantly opposed to trans rights are most likely to believe QAnon conspiracy theories, are the same people who are, screaming about Satan and demons at school board meetings because, oh my God, their kids might have to wear a mask in a pandemic. The same people who are most likely to refuse to get vaccinated for religious reasons, who are trying to argue that they should have religious exemptions, who have actually won in court the right, which I want to put in quotation marks because I don't really, this historical precedent, even of our Supreme Court, would say that, you don't have a right to defy public health measures in a pandemic just because you're a church. But the courts have been so stacked by the Christian right that they're starting to grant those kinds of absurd exemptions. It's the same people. And so, give them an inch, they'll take a mile.
Those are great examples.
Yeah, this is also interconnected. What is at stake here is any kind of deviation from what these right-wing Christian organizations have deemed is appropriate in their minds. It goes far beyond just LGBT issues, or even trans-specific issues. Like you said, there is absolutely these connected, legally, the underpinnings extend to any kind of bodily autonomy, especially reproductive justice. One of the pieces of legislation that we urgently need that would go a long way towards handling the whole interconnected web of issues here and what's at stake is the Equality Act. The Equality Act is often thought of as an LGBT bill, and it is, but it is so much more, and that makes it all the more important. The simplest way to summarize is that when we pass the Equality Act, we will have explicit non-discrimination protections for LGBT people. And so that's why it's thought of as an LGBT bill. That's why so many LGBT organizations have been pushing for it for years and years. Right now, it's sitting with the Senate. And it being an LGBT rights bill would be reason enough to support it, obviously. But what doesn't get as much attention is that actually, when you look at the bill language, it would extend protections on the basis of gender as well. It would extend protections on the basis of race as well, on national origin as well. Because really what it does is it fills all these gaps in our other non-discrimination laws. The Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Acts are thought of as basically handling non-discrimination protections, especially when it comes to race. But in actuality, these bills were passed so long ago that they do not accurately capture all the parts of our daily life today. For example, it is illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of race on a bus, but there's actually no federal law that says it's illegal in a Lyft or an Uber ride, because these bills were passed decades ago before ride-sharing services existed. So it just really illustrates the gaps in our protections. We need to update all of these protections, even the ones that you might assume we already have, we might not actually have on the basis of gender or sex or race or national origin or so on and so forth. We need a comprehensive update to all of these non-discrimination protections to really make it undeniable, to put it in simple black and white terms that it is illegal under federal law to do this stuff to people. So I really want to urge everyone to contact your senator, have them support the Equality Act. Yes, to protect trans people, but actually to protect all of us on multiple parts of our lives. You can go to passtheequalityact.org. There you can find your senator if you don't know them already. Do not assume that your senator is supportive. A lot of senators are, but they're still getting lots of phone calls from our opposition. So even if you live in, let's say, California, that's always assumed to be this deep blue state, right? Do not assume your senator's support. If your senator is on the fence, they need to hear from you. But also, if your senator is already on record as being for the Equality Act, they still need to hear from you to understand that this is a priority that their constituents actually care about. We have to break through the noise, especially in this kind of gridlocked political environment. So go to passtheequalityact.com or .org, they actually both work, and you'll see a lot of really simple talking points there. But really all you have to do is say, I am a constituent, I live in your state, and I want you to support this bill.
Great. Allison, do you want to add anything?
No, not particularly. I think it was well covered.
No, I completely agree. That was great. So again, and I think it's important that we understand what's happening in society, in state legislatures and in the courts. It's really also important that we know as secular individuals and as members of secular organizations, what we can do to stop and defeat the religious-based discrimination against trans people. So to all of you, I said, what are your recommendations on what we can do to have the most impact to separate religious dogma from civil rights?
I'll defer to you, Rodrigo.
I feel like I already said mine, Equality Act. I mean, again, that is, although it is thought of as an LGBT rights bill, it goes so much further and it really handles a lot of the underpinning of a lot of the other threats that are out there. So yes, I would say Equality Act. And then the second thing I would say, because I'll cheat a little bit here, is to to contact your state and local representatives. One of the things we see a lot is that people when they think of government, they think of Congress and the White House. And they kind of forget that actually a lot of the laws and policies that govern our everyday lives are handled at the state and local level. And your influence there goes even further. If you contact your state rep or your state senator, it goes a long way because they don't actually hear from their constituents as much. It's considered kind of a less visible or more esoteric part of our legislative system. So, contact your state and local representatives, and don't, along these same lines, don't assume that if you live in a more progressive state, you see one of these anti-trans bills introduced and you go, that'll never pass. I don't need to contact them. You do. It is our complacency that actually allows these bills to go a lot further than is acceptable. And let's be real, if these bills generate a single headline, there's going to be some trans person who reads that headline and our hearts break. Because that dignitary harm, right? The extension of that Allison referenced, that is like a legal concept, but it goes for everyday life as well. So we need to stop these bills in their tracks in all 50 states, even in the states where, sure, the bill's never going to pass, but the fact that it even gets a committee hearing normalizes attacks on trans people. And it kind of sets a tone in our culture that it's okay to attack people just for who they are. And I think we can all agree that that's not acceptable. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And it has a real impact as well on trans young people. There's been research on this showing that there's, it has a real psychologically negative impact when the trans young people are under attack in a state. Like there's been really evidence of that. But I have two things I wanted to highlight. First of all, we encourage you to sign up. I know NCTE does action alerts on these different types of bills at the federal and state level. So does American Atheists. So we encourage you to sign up at atheist.org. And and also at NCTE, obviously, for
transequality.org for that one. Thanks, Allison.
Perfect. For different action alerts, and that way, when something is happening at your state at the federal level, we'll tell you and actually help you. It's a super easy system. It directs you exactly where to send lawmaker letters so that they're most effective, which makes it much easier for you to help. The other thing is, I guess I just want to emphasize that I think Chrissy and Rodrigo both talked about the need for cultural change and how important it is for people to actually know trans people. But even if you're not trans as a secular person, you can help spread that awareness. You can pass this video when you get it around to different people and your family and friends. You can take some of the great materials from NCT on trans people and help educate people. But that sort of cultural change does depend on everyone. And, as a mostly probably, I guess, largely non-trans audience, you can really help in those ways. So I'll just stop there.
I absolutely agree with Rodrigo and Allison on those points. And I'll note that long ago, the Christian right figured out that winning local political battles, local and state, is hugely important. They've done so much damage through taking over school boards, and not just now when you're seeing them looking ridiculous, screaming about demons on TV. I mean, they've been doing it for decades and influencing the curriculum in ways that distort it. Today they're screaming about critical race theory, although they don't even know what it is. But basically, they don't want kids to learn that there's a lot of racism in American history or any at all, right? They just want to kind of just skip over that part. And what I would add to that, so get involved, win local and state level political battles, because even if we lose at the Supreme Court, as we're likely to do for a long time now, those state and local politics matters a lot. Also support children's rights. And this is a thing where at the national level, you can also advocate for the United States to finally sign on to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're the only member nation of the United Nations that actually has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is pretty shameful. Allison was talking about, all these discussions about parents' rights and people on the right wing, arguing for their right to deny their children health care. In some cases, by the way, that can apply whether or not they're transgender, right? There are some faith healing only communities that don't want to let their kids have any kind of life-saving health care. There are exemptions like that on the books that still exist. And, as Rodrigo was mentioning, you might think a lot of rights and protections exist that actually don't. Well, there is no federal right for children to have, for example, a robust education. That's been very clear since 1973, Wisconsin v. Yoder, when it was decided that the Amish communities can stop educating their children after 8th grade. Kids don't have many recognized rights in America, and that does disproportionately harm queer kids, but not only.
I appreciate all that from all of you. And we sort of had almost a follow-up question from Anne in the audience. She says, aside from love, acceptance, and advocacy, which you've just talked about, how can I best support trans youth in my life?
Well, I feel like that's it right there. Those are tall orders already. Love, acceptance, and advocacy. But I appreciate that question so much. I mean, I think the other thing that you can do as the next step there is foster their involvement in activism. When you're young, you don't probably already know how the government works, but you are already being hurt by government policy. The laws are already holding you back. And yet you don't actually, even less than most adults do about what to do about it. And if you're even younger, you can't vote yet, probably. And so the one thing that feels like democracy isn't actually available to you yet. So I think when you're in that stage in life where you're dealing with being trans and all the discrimination that your community faces, first, you need that love and affirmation from your family and your loved ones. So love that you're already there. And then it can mean a lot to feel that sense of empowerment from being able to actually take your fate in your own hands, and take action on these issues instead of just being upset about them. So I would say the next level is to really fostering their civic engagement, and fostering their activism so that they can feel a sense of power and control in otherwise hard times.
Anyone else like to jump in? And then I know for me, and a little bit of following up on Rodrigo, is a really, I think fostering their activism. What are their passions? What are they excited about? Supporting them in those avenues and how you can help them do that. And I think just at a more basic level for all youth is not making assumptions on who they are or their identity, and allowing them that space to develop that. And so it's, using language that's more open that you're probably normally used to, that allows them to feel comfortable in exploring things in life. And we know that, LGBT youth and just youth in general are less about labels and more about sort of, identifying in these broader concepts than a lot of adults are used to and comfortable with. And so allowing them that space, I think, is one of the best things. And using inclusive language, we are not making assumptions about their gender or about who they're going to be attracted to and who they're going to fall in love with, just in general, and allowing them the space to figure that out and come to you and share that with you, and then just support them. And again, share them, you love them, with accept them.
You may also have kids in your life. If, like me, you have a lot of evangelical family members, for example, whose parents are not safe, and you can't really directly do a lot of intervention there, but you can work to kind of subtly let them know that if they need to talk about these issues, you'd be someone who is safe for them to come to, particularly as they get older. That's a bit of a tricky issue, but there are a lot of kids out there who don't have supportive family, and you can try to simply in little ways signal that you're someone who's safe for them if they're struggling.
We had a question sort of specific about Tyson Foods and hiring chaplains in the workplace, and being a legitimate concern about if you have chaplains in a employer, from an employer, what sort of are you promoting with your employees and those sorts of things. But I would take a step out, and I think in employment situations, if they're what are effective avenues in making sure that LGBT people are protected and it's not a coercive environment?
Well, again, we're back to the Equality Act, and we'll emphasize the need for that again. But there is protections based on the Bostock decision, which I mentioned earlier. So if we're talking about discrimination or harassment based on, for example, either religion or on, sex, is defined to include sexual orientation and gender identity, those complaints can be made at both the federal, and state level. And that can include both discrimination and harassment. So if there's like an atmosphere, the question talks about an atmosphere where there's like a lot of chaplains and they might find it harassing. If it's pervasive enough where it makes it difficult to function and work, then that can be a form of discrimination. So that's a short answer. It's a little bit off topic, so I'm just gonna stop there if that's okay.
One thing that I found just helpful and nice when I was living in Indiana, when they passed their updated state RFRA, the Religious Freedom Reformation Act, a lot of businesses started posting stickers that said, "This business serves everyone," just to make sure that they were not on board with religious refusals of service. And that made me want to spend my money at those businesses,
Definitely. Well, good. We've gone just a tad bit over today, but I do want to thank you all. Thank you for participating, and thank everyone for joining. We will be sending this out. I'll include some of the links so you have that additional information that comes out to you. But again, Chrissy, Rodrigo, and Allison, thank you so much for your time. I truly, truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for having us, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Have a good evening.